December 19th, 1944, 11 a.m., a converted French barracks in Verdun smells of wet wool, cigarette smoke, and panic. Maps are pinned to the walls, their neat arrows already obsolete. Outside, snow falls in thick, quiet sheets, muffling the sound of trucks grinding their gears in the courtyard. Inside, the most powerful men in the Western Allied command stand frozen, not by cold, but by the realization that the war they thought they were winning has just turned savage. 3 days earlier, 200,000 German troops had erupted out of the Ardennes like a buried corpse clawing its way back to life. American lines collapsed. Entire regiments vanished into forests choked with fog and artillery smoke. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was surrounded, running out of ammunition, blood freezing in open wounds. This was not a counterattack. This was a calculated gamble by a desperate enemy, and it was working. At the center of the room stands Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, face drawn tight, eyes scanning the men he needs to save the situation. He asks a simple question, the kind that sounds procedural but carries the weight of thousands of lives. How soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? No one answers. Generals look down at their maps, at the distances, the clogged roads, the frozen fuel lines. They know what the question really means. How fast can you do the impossible? Then a voice cuts through the silence, sharp, almost impatient. I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. Heads turn. Some stare in disbelief. Others in open irritation. The voice belongs to George S. Patton, standing rigid, polished helmet under his arm, ivory-handled revolvers heavy at his hips. To the men in that room, what he has just said borders on madness. His Third Army is facing east. To attack north, he would have to disengage 3 divisions in contact with the enemy, pivot an entire army 90 degrees, move over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles through icy roads already choked with refugees and wreckage, and launch an attack against elite German forces in winter conditions. In 2 days. On paper, it cannot be done. In reality, it already has been. Patton is not improvising. He is revealing. For 11 days, while Allied headquarters dismissed scattered intelligence reports as noise, Patton had been preparing for this exact disaster. 15 German divisions had vanished from the line. Not broken, not destroyed. Removed. Hidden. His intelligence chief had brought him the maps, the intercepted radio traffic, the prisoner interrogations. The Ardennes again, the same ground the Germans used in 1940. Everyone else said no sane commander would try it twice. Patton knew better. The enemy always returns to the place where arrogance once paid off. Now the bill has come due. American soldiers are paying it in frozen foxholes and burning villages. And in this room, surrounded by men who planned for consensus and hope, stands a general who planned for catastrophe. Eisenhower studies Patton's face, searching for doubt, for exaggeration, for the telltale signs of a man selling bravado instead of certainty. He finds none. What he sees instead is something far more dangerous to a coalition built on caution. A commander who anticipated the enemy instead of explaining him away. A man who does not ask permission from reality. Outside, the snow keeps falling. At Bastogne, men are dying by the hour. And the fate of the Western Front now hangs on whether this promise, so casually delivered, is genius or suicide. Because once Eisenhower nods, once the order is given, there will be no time left for second thoughts, only for engines starting, columns turning, and an entire army wheeling north into the teeth of a battle that everyone else failed to see coming. A battle that will decide not just whether Bastogne lives, but whether the illusion of control the Allied command has been clinging to can survive the brutal truth that war does not forgive those who plan for the war they want instead of the war they are already in. And Patton, who has been waiting for this moment, knows that in 48 hours the maps in this room will be worthless, the theories will be silent. And the only thing that will matter is whether speed and violence can still bend fate before the Germans close their fist completely around the American line and crush it. Because once that happens, no amount of speeches, conferences, or political calculation will be able to undo what is already unfolding in the frozen forests of the Ardennes as the Third Army begins to move, and the gamble that everyone else refused to make is finally, irrevocably, set into motion, with Patton already thinking not about Bastogne alone, but about what comes after, about the enemy's next mistake. about how far he can drive before someone behind him decides he has gone too far, because he knows from bitter experience that the most dangerous enemy he will face is not always wearing a German uniform, but is often sitting comfortably miles behind the front, convinced that caution is wisdom, that restraint is maturity, and that the man who sees disaster coming first must surely be exaggerating. Until the sound of guns makes liars of them all, and history moves forward without waiting for approval, carrying with it the blood of those who trusted the wrong men at the wrong time. As Patton steps out into the cold, already issuing orders, already counting hours, already certain that if he hesitates now, everything will be lost and the war itself will take a darker turn than anyone in that room is prepared to admit. And as engines roar to life and steel begins to roll north, the question is no longer whether he can do it, but whether anyone will have the courage to let him finish what he is about to begin when the cost becomes clear and the reckoning arrives sooner than they expect, because Patton has never feared the enemy as much as he has feared being stopped at the moment when speed is the only thing standing between survival and annihilation, and he knows, deep down, that this will not be the last time he is right while others hesitate, not the last time he is ready while the rest are still debating, not the last time that being prepared will make him dangerous not just to the enemy, but to the men who command him and are about to realize, far too late, that they are following a general who is already fighting the next battle in his head while they are still struggling to understand the one that has just begun and is still unfolding as the snow keeps falling and the clock keeps ticking and the war shows no mercy to those who arrive late, no matter how senior, respected, or well-intentioned they may be, because the battlefield does not care about rank or reputation, only about who saw the truth first and acted while there was still time. And as Patton's columns disappear into the white horizon, the silence he leaves behind in Verdun is not relief, but dread, because if he fails, the disaster will be complete, and if he succeeds, the questions his success will raise will haunt the Allied command long after the guns fall silent, as the story of this winter begins to write itself in blood, steel, and frozen ground, with no pause, no apology, and no guarantee that anyone in power will be willing to admit what it took to survive when the war came back from the dead and demanded to be taken seriously. Again, just as it always does, just as it is doing now, as the Third Army turns north and the gamble begins to unfold in full, merciless motion, with Patton already pushing beyond what he has been told, beyond what he has been allowed, beyond what the maps say is possible, because he knows the enemy is already doing the same, and stopping now would mean surrendering not just ground, but the initiative itself, and once that is gone, there is no getting it back. Only watching as events overtake intention, and the price is paid by men who never sat in this room and never had a voice in the decisions that sent them into the cold. And as the first units move out, the truth becomes unavoidable that this moment, this decision, this promise spoken so calmly in a room full of doubt, will either stand as one of the greatest acts of foresight in the war or as the beginning of a catastrophe that no one will be able to explain away afterward. Because the war does not care about explanations, only about results. And Patton, who understands that better than anyone alive, is already moving, already committed, already beyond recall, as the winter of 1944 tightens its grip and the next chapter of the war surges forward with brutal inevitability, carrying with it the fate of Bastogne, the reputation of commanders, and the lives of tens of thousands of men who will never know how close they came to being abandoned by hesitation alone, as the engines fade into the distance and the silence in Verdun deepens, heavy with the knowledge that the war has just demanded a level of decisiveness that most men are simply not built to give, and that the one man who was ready to give it is now gone, racing north, toward a destiny that will either vindicate him or destroy him, with no middle ground left and no turning back as the snow continues to fall and the clock continues to count down toward whatever calm. The illusion of surprise was comforting, and that was the real danger. In the weeks before the Ardennes exploded, Allied headquarters convinced itself the German army was finished, bled white, incapable of anything more than stubborn defense. The maps showed a broken enemy. The casualty tables showed victory. The optimism was bureaucratic, not earned, built in warm rooms far from the sound of artillery. By early December 1944, The Western Front stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, over 450 miles of front line held by Allied forces that believed the war was entering its final act. Paris had been liberated. Brussels was free. German units were retreating, surrendering in droves, abandoning equipment by the roadside. Senior planners spoke openly of crossing the Rhine in early 1945 and ending the war by summer. The Ardennes sector, quiet, wooded, road-poor, became the place where tired divisions were sent to rest. That decision alone sealed what came next. The Ardennes was held by 4 American divisions spread thin across terrain that should have required at least a dozen. Some units were green, others exhausted from Normandy and the hedgerows. Supply dumps were light. Artillery coverage was weak. Air support was assumed, not guaranteed. The forests were considered impassable to large armored formations, especially in winter. That assumption was repeated so often it hardened into doctrine, and doctrine replaced thinking. German intelligence saw everything. They watched troop rotations, noted the lack of depth, listened as radio discipline loosened. The German plan was brutally simple. Concentrate overwhelming force against the weakest sector, achieve surprise through weather and terrain, break through fast, then drive west toward Antwerp. Split the Allied armies in 2. Force a negotiated peace, or at least buy time. Hitler called it a last throw of the dice. His generals called it reckless. They executed it anyway. What Allied intelligence missed was not subtle. 15 German divisions had vanished from the line. Entire panzer formations were pulled back, refitted, hidden under forest canopy. Fuel and ammunition were stockpiled in quantities inconsistent with defense. Rail traffic surged at night. Prisoners spoke of movement, of orders to attack west, of a coming storm. These reports were filed, summarized, explained away. Higher headquarters preferred reassurance to alarm. The weather became the final accomplice. Low cloud cover, snow, and fog grounded Allied aircraft, the one advantage the Germans feared most. Without fighter bombers overhead, German columns could move in daylight. Tank engines echoed through valleys no one was watching. On December 16th, at 5:30 a.m., German artillery opened fire across the Ardennes, and the war that Allied planners thought was ending suddenly returned to its most primitive form. The initial impact was catastrophic. American infantry units were hit before they understood they were under attack. Command posts were overrun. Phone lines were cut. Units dissolved in confusion, not from cowardice, but from isolation. German Kampfgruppen moved with speed and discipline born of desperation. They wore American uniforms, spoke English, spread chaos at crossroads and rear areas. The front did not bend. It tore. At Allied headquarters, disbelief came first, then paralysis. This was not how the end of the war was supposed to look. The Ardennes offensive did not fit the narrative of inevitable victory, and so precious hours were lost while commanders argued about intent. Was this a feint? A local counterattack? A last spasm? The scale was underestimated even as divisions were being surrounded. In Bastogne, the reality was unmistakable. The town was a road hub, nothing more, but it became a symbol because it sat astride every German route west. The 101st Airborne, rushed in by truck without winter gear, dug into frozen ground under constant shelling. Medical supplies ran out. Ammunition was rationed. Men burned furniture to stay warm. German envoys demanded surrender. The answer was defiance, but defiance alone does not stop tanks. Meanwhile, on the German side, there was awe and fear in equal measure. German officers reported astonishment at how quickly American resistance stiffened once command stabilized. They feared one thing above all else: a rapid, armored counterstroke from the south. They knew which American general specialized in that kind of response. His name appeared again and again in German reports, spoken with a mixture of respect and dread. The Ardennes offensive was not just a battlefield crisis. It was an indictment. It exposed how thoroughly Allied leadership had allowed optimism to replace vigilance. It revealed the cost of ignoring intelligence that did not align with preferred outcomes. It showed what happens when planning assumes the enemy will cooperate with your expectations. And as the snow deepened and the casualty list grew, the war made its demand clear. Someone had to move fast, not with meetings or memoranda, but with steel, fuel, and men willing to drive into chaos. The question was no longer whether the Germans could be stopped. It was whether the Allied command structure, heavy with caution and politics, could adapt quickly enough to let the one commander who had seen this coming do what he had prepared to do. Because every hour lost meant another American unit cut off, another road seized, another chance slipping away, as the Ardennes burned and the illusion of control collapsed under the weight of a war that refused to end quietly. Patton thrived in moments like this because chaos was his natural habitat. Where other generals needed order to think, he needed friction. He believed war was not a problem to be solved, but a force to be unleashed, and that belief shaped everything about him. The polished helmet, the ivory-handled pistols, the theatrical profanity were not vanity alone. They were weapons. He understood morale as an instrument of war, fear as something to be redirected outward, never allowed to settle inward. To Patton, hesitation was moral failure. He believed speed saved lives, not caution, because speed denied the enemy time to think. He had learned this lesson obsessively, studying Napoleon, Caesar, the German Blitzkrieg, and he believed, with unsettling certainty, that he was destined to fight wars, that history had been rehearsing him for this role across centuries. Many dismissed this as madness. His soldiers understood it differently. When Patton said he would attack in 48 hours, they believed him because he never spoke in conditional terms. He spoke as if the future had already happened, and he was merely remembering it. Across the command structure stood men built for a different war. Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a battlefield mystic. He was a manager of men, egos, and nations. Eisenhower's genius was political gravity. He absorbed pressure so others could function. He listened, negotiated, soothed, compromised. He understood that the war could be lost not only on the battlefield but at conference tables, in parliaments, in newspapers. His task was not to win fast, but to keep everyone moving in the same direction without tearing the alliance apart. Eisenhower admired Patton and feared him in equal measure. He knew Patton was often right before others caught up, but he also knew Patton was uncontrollable. Patton did not understand coalition warfare because he did not respect it. He believed allies should follow the best general, not the most diplomatic one. Eisenhower understood that attitude, however effective tactically, could destroy everything strategically. So he kept Patton on a leash, long enough to kill Germans, short enough to keep him from embarrassing presidents. Then there was Bernard Montgomery, a man who represented the opposite pole of Patton's philosophy. Montgomery believed war was something to be domesticated, slowed, rendered safe through preparation. He distrusted improvisation. He despised risk. His victories were built on overwhelming force applied at carefully chosen moments, and when those conditions were not met, he preferred to wait. To his admirers, this was professionalism. To his critics, it was paralysis disguised as prudence. Montgomery loathed Patton instinctively. Patton's speed made Montgomery's caution look like fear. Patton's victories made Montgomery's delays visible. Where Patton sought decisive destruction, Montgomery sought tidy progress. Where Patton trusted instinct and momentum, Montgomery trusted plans and supply tables. Their rivalry was not personal at first. It was philosophical. Two incompatible views of how wars are won. In the Ardennes crisis, that clash became lethal. Montgomery argued for consolidation, for stabilizing the line, for methodical countermeasures. He wanted time. Time to organize, time to gather strength, time to reduce uncertainty. Patton saw time as the enemy. Every hour, he believed, allowed German armor to dig in, to escape, to regroup. He did not want to stabilize the bulge. He wanted to cut it off and kill it. German commanders understood this difference better than many Allied ones. They feared Patton precisely because he did not behave like the generals they had studied. He did not pause when doctrine said pause. He did not wait when logistics lagged. He pushed until something broke, usually the enemy. To German eyes, Montgomery was predictable. Eisenhower was distant. Patton was dangerous. Inside Allied headquarters, the psychological fault line widened. Eisenhower stood between these men, absorbing Montgomery's caution and Patton's fury, knowing that choosing either fully would alienate the other. He tried to balance them, to use Patton's aggression without letting it define the war, to respect Montgomery's method without letting it smother momentum. It was a compromise born of politics, not combat. Patton sensed this and despised it. He believed the war could be ended faster, cleaner, with fewer American dead if decisions were made by soldiers instead of committees. Every delay felt to him like betrayal, every missed opportunity like murder by paperwork. He wrote letters filled with rage, spoke openly of being restrained by men who did not understand what was happening at the front. As the Ardennes burned, these personalities were no longer abstractions. They were forces shaping reality. Patton pushed. Montgomery cautioned. Eisenhower calculated. And while they argued, men froze, bled, and died in forests that had become killing grounds not because the enemy was brilliant, but because the Allied command had underestimated him and then hesitated when speed was demanded. The battle was no longer just against German armor. It was against the inertia of caution, the fear of political fallout, the reluctance to trust the one general who had seen the storm coming and prepared to ride straight into it, knowing full well that even if he succeeded, the same men who doubted him now would soon be searching for reasons to slow him down again. Because Patton was not just a weapon against the enemy, he was a threat to the way the war was being managed, and that made him as dangerous to his own side as he was to the Germans. A fact that would only become clearer as the counterattack unfolded and the cost of delay continued to be paid in blood, mile by mile, hour by hour, with no patience left for theory and no forgiveness left for those who mistook caution for wisdom while the war demanded action. The breaking point did not arrive with a single order or a dramatic explosion. It arrived with a decision delayed just long enough to make everything worse. In the first 48 hours after the German attack, Allied headquarters still clung to the idea that this was containable, that the line could be patched, that time was available. That belief cost lives immediately. On December 17th, as German armored columns pushed west through fog and snow, requests for authority to counterattack were slowed by procedure. Corps commanders asked for fuel. Army commanders asked for permission. Permission had to travel up a chain crowded with uncertainty. Every level hesitated, not out of cowardice, but out of fear of making the wrong political move. The result was paralysis in the exact moment when paralysis was fatal. The most damaging error was the failure to immediately commit mobile reserves. Allied doctrine preached flexibility, yet reserves were held back to protect hypothetical threats instead of crushing the real one unfolding in front of them. German Kampfgruppen exploited this vacuum with ruthless efficiency. Road junctions fell. Supply dumps were seized. American units were cut off not by superior numbers, but by speed. At Bastogne, the situation deteriorated hour by hour. The decision to rush the 101st Airborne into the town was brave, but incomplete. They were sent without adequate artillery, without winter clothing, without a clear plan for immediate relief. It was a symbolic move, not a decisive one. The assumption was that relief would come in time. No one defined what "in time" actually meant. Meanwhile, the Germans made their own fatal gamble. They pushed too far, too fast, burning fuel they could not replace. Their supply lines stretched thin, relying on captured Allied depots that often turned out to be empty or destroyed. Their timetable assumed Allied indecision would last longer than it did. That assumption was about to collide with reality. The Real trigger came when Eisenhower finally made the call to unleash Patton's Third Army northward. This was not a routine redeployment. It was a rupture in the Allied command's usual rhythm. The order cut through weeks of planning and hierarchy in a single stroke. Patton was given authority to do what he had already begun doing, moving divisions before paperwork could catch up. Even then, resistance remained. Fuel allocations were questioned. Supply officers hesitated. Routes were debated. Every mile Patton's columns advanced was fought not just against snow and German rearguards, but against the inertia of a system designed to prevent mistakes, not exploit opportunities. Patton ignored much of it. He redirected convoys. He stripped rear areas. He took fuel meant for other units and used it to keep his spearheads moving. This defiance was not accidental. It was deliberate. Patton understood that the window was closing. German units inside the bulge were vulnerable only while they were advancing. Once they stopped, once they dug in, the cost of removing them would multiply. Every delay increased American casualties exponentially. He chose to accept the risk of disobedience over the certainty of attrition. The Germans felt the shift almost immediately. Reports from the southern shoulder of the bulge spoke of American armor appearing where it should not have been, faster than expected, in strength that suggested preparation, not improvisation. German commanders realized too late that the one Allied general they feared most had been waiting for this moment. By December 22nd, as the German demand for surrender reached Bastogne and was rejected with a single word, the momentum had already begun to turn. Not because the Allied command had suddenly become brilliant, but because one commander had been allowed, barely, to act on instinct instead of consensus. The breaking point had passed. What followed would be brutal, costly, and far from clean. The German bulge would not collapse overnight. Men would still die by the thousands in frozen fields and shattered villages. But the initiative had shifted, and in war, initiative is everything. The trigger was pulled not by a single order, but by the moment when hesitation finally gave way to action, when authority was granted just late enough to be dangerous and just early enough to matter. And as Patton's tanks ground north through snow and wreckage, it became clear that the real crisis had never been the German attack itself, but the Allied reluctance to believe that the war still demanded ruthlessness, speed, and the willingness to let a dangerous man do exactly what he had been warning them he would have to do all along. Because once that choice was made, there would be no turning back, only the long, bloody reckoning of whether action delayed could still redeem the lives already lost, and the ones about to be sacrificed in the days that followed as the counterstroke gathered force and the Ardennes began, slowly, to give back the ground it had swallowed. The crisis peaked not in a single explosion of violence, but in a grinding convergence of failure, courage, and arithmetic. By Christmas week, the Ardennes had become a ledger written in blood. Every mile of frozen road was paid for twice, once by the men holding it, and once by the men sent to take it back. As Patton's columns drove north, they did not encounter a collapsing enemy. They ran headlong into German units fighting with the ferocity of men who knew retreat meant annihilation. Snowstorms erased landmarks. Tanks slid into ditches. Engines froze overnight. Infantry advanced with frostbitten feet, rifles icing over between shots. Speed, Patton's great weapon, now fought against terrain and weather as much as against German guns. The Germans concentrated everything they had left on slowing the relief of Bastogne. Roadblocks sprang up overnight. Anti-tank guns were hidden at bends and village entrances. American spearheads were ambushed repeatedly, losing tanks in narrow streets where maneuver was impossible. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Every delay meant another day the 101st Airborne remained surrounded. Inside the pocket, the cost was becoming unbearable. Casualties mounted daily from shellfire, exposure, and untreated wounds. Medics worked with bare hands in freezing aid stations. Plasma ran out. Morphine was rationed. Men shared foxholes with the dead because the ground was too hard to dig new ones. German artillery fell with methodical cruelty, not random terror. They knew exactly where the American perimeter lay. On December 23rd, the weather finally broke. Allied aircraft filled the sky, dropping supplies into Bastogne and strafing German positions. It was a reprieve, not a rescue. The supplies bought time, not freedom. German armor still ringed the town, and the noose tightened again as soon as the skies closed. South of Bastogne, Patton paid the price of his haste. Units were fed into battle piecemeal, because waiting for perfect coordination would mean waiting too long. Regiments attacked with incomplete intelligence. Some advances stalled completely, pinned down by small but well-placed German detachments that refused to yield. Casualties spiked. Company commanders fell. Platoons vanished in forests where maps were useless. The numbers tell the story the communiques softened. In the first 10 days of the battle, American forces suffered tens of thousands of casualties. Entire divisions were rendered combat ineffective. Vehicles were abandoned not because they were hit, but because there was no fuel to move them. The Germans, for all their aggression, were bleeding faster than they could replace. Fuel shortages crippled their advance. Tanks ran dry at critical moments. Orders were issued that could not be executed. German commanders began to realize the truth they had feared. The Allied counterattack was not cautious. It was converging. From the north, forces pressed methodically. From the south, Patton's army came on with relentless pressure. The bulge that had looked so promising on maps now became a trap, its flanks under constant assault, its interior clogged with wounded, broken vehicles, and starving troops. On December 26th, Patton's lead elements broke through to Bastogne. The relief was not dramatic. There was no sudden collapse of German lines, no triumphant parade. It was a narrow corridor carved under fire, barely wide enough to keep open. But it was enough. The siege was broken. The price was staggering. Thousands of American casualties lay along the roads Patton's army had taken. Tanks burned in villages whose names would never be remembered outside after-action reports. German losses were just as severe. Entire formations shattered beyond repair. The Ardennes offensive had consumed what little strategic reserve Germany had left in the West. Yet even as relief arrived, the battle was far from over. The bulge still existed. German units fought on with grim determination, and Allied forces continued to pay for every attempt to straighten the line. What had changed was not the violence, but the inevitability. The initiative was gone from German hands, wrested away at enormous cost. The crisis peak revealed the brutal truth behind the maps and speeches. Victory did not come from clever plans or hopeful assumptions. It came from endurance, from speed paid for in blood, from commanders willing to accept casualties now to prevent catastrophes later. The Ardennes became a proving ground not just for armies, but for philosophies of command. As the snow deepened and the casualty lists lengthened, it became clear that the cost of hesitation had been measured in days lost and lives spent, and the cost of action, though terrible, had at least bent the battle back from the brink. The war moved on, scarred and slower, but no longer blind, carrying forward the knowledge that it had nearly been undone not by enemy brilliance, but by its own willingness to believe the fighting was almost finished when it was about to become most lethal of all. The battlefield cost was immediate, measurable, and unforgiving. By the time the bulge began to shrink, the ground itself had become evidence of failure paid for in flesh. Snow-covered fields hid bodies where they fell, sometimes for weeks, sometimes forever. Frozen vehicles lined roads like abandoned skeletons, mute testimony to how fast momentum could die when fuel, weather, and time conspired against it. American losses in the Ardennes reached roughly 89,000 casualties. That number included more than 19,000 dead, killed not only by bullets and shells, but by exposure, frostbite, and exhaustion. Entire infantry companies were reduced to handfuls of survivors. Some divisions lost a third of their strength in less than a month. Replacement troops arrived wide-eyed and untrained, stepping directly into combat against veterans hardened by desperation. German losses were just as catastrophic and strategically fatal. Estimates range from 70,000 to over 100,000 casualties, numbers Germany could no longer absorb. Panzer divisions that had taken years to build were destroyed in days. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel littered forests and roadsides. Crews blew up their own vehicles to prevent capture, then marched east on foot, hunted from the air whenever the weather cleared. The material cost was staggering. Thousands of Allied vehicles were destroyed or rendered unusable. Artillery pieces were lost in overrun positions. Ammunition stocks vanished in explosions when depots fell into German hands or were deliberately destroyed to deny their use. German losses in heavy equipment were irreplaceable. By January 1945, many German divisions existed only on paper, their combat power gone. The psychological toll was worse. American soldiers who survived the Ardennes carried it with them for the rest of the war. They had seen how quickly certainty could collapse, how promises of an easy end could turn into nightmares of encirclement and cold. Veterans spoke of the silence between artillery barges, of the way sound carried through frozen forests, of the fear that crept in at night when engines stopped and the temperature dropped below zero. For German soldiers, the Ardennes marked the end of illusion. Many entered the offensive believing it could change the war. They emerged knowing it had only hastened the end. Prisoners spoke openly of despair, of orders that made no sense, of fighting for ground they could not hold. Officers admitted they had known it was a gamble, but not that it would consume everything they had left. The tactical consequences were clear. The German army in the West never recovered its ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations. The Ardennes offensive drained reserves that could have delayed the Allied crossing of the Rhine. Instead, it cleared the way. Units that might have defended Germany's borders were destroyed in Belgian forests and Luxembourg villages, far from where they were needed most. On the Allied side, the cost reshaped priorities. Caution returned, but it was a chastened caution, no longer wrapped in complacency. Intelligence reports were scrutinized differently. Assumptions were questioned more aggressively. The belief that the enemy was finished was replaced with a harder truth. He was beaten, but still dangerous, and capable of killing thousands if underestimated. The men who paid the highest price were not the ones who made the decisions. They were the riflemen holding roadblocks at dawn, the tank crews advancing into villages where every window hid a gun, the medics working until their hands went numb and then working anyway. They paid for days lost to hesitation and nights spent debating instead of moving. By the time the bulge was erased, the ground had been churned into a graveyard. The Ardennes was no longer a quiet sector or a place to rest divisions. It was a scar across the Western Front, a reminder carved into frozen soil that wars do not end because leaders expect them to, and that every misjudgment at the top multiplies itself downward until it reaches men who have no choice but to absorb the consequences. The battlefield cost of the Ardennes was not just in numbers, but in what those numbers represented. Lost momentum, lost innocence, lost faith in easy victory. The war moved forward after January 1945 with renewed force, but also with the weight of what had almost happened pressing down on every advance, because everyone involved understood that this disaster had not been inevitable, and that knowledge, more than the cold or the casualties, lingered long after the snow melted and the front moved east, carrying with it the memory of how close everything had come to breaking completely. The long shadow of the Ardennes stretched far beyond the frozen forests where it was fought. When the guns finally quieted, the front straightened, and the headlines declared victory, the real damage was only beginning to register in rooms far from the battlefield. The battle had not just consumed men and machines. It had exposed the fault lines in how the war was being run. Strategically, the German gamble failed in its stated aims, but succeeded in one grim respect. It bought time in the east. While German divisions were annihilated in the west, the delay imposed by the Ardennes allowed Soviet forces to advance deeper into Central Europe, largely unopposed by any meaningful German reserve. The war did not end sooner because of the bulge. It ended differently. The map that emerged in 1945 was shaped as much by what happened in Belgium as by what happened in Berlin. The Western Allies paid for delay with geography. Every week lost in the Ardennes was a week the Red Army advanced westward. Cities that might have been reached by American or British forces fell instead under Soviet occupation. The political reality of post-war Europe hardened while Allied commanders were fighting to recover ground they had already believed secure. The Iron Curtain did not descend overnight. It was laid down mile by mile while attention and strength were consumed elsewhere. Inside the Allied command, the Ardennes triggered a quiet reckoning. Publicly, unity was preserved. Privately, trust was damaged. American commanders remembered who had dismissed warnings and who had seen the danger coming. British commanders remembered how close the alliance had come to catastrophe. The rhetoric of shared victory masked a growing resentment that would surface in the post-war years, when memoirs replaced communiques and blame could finally be assigned without consequence. The political cost was paid in silence as much as an argument. No senior leader was removed because of the Ardennes. No doctrine was publicly repudiated. Instead, responsibility dissolved upward and outward until it belonged to no one in particular. The lesson was absorbed indirectly. Never again assume the enemy is finished. Never again leave a sector thin because it feels quiet. Never again confuse optimism with intelligence. These lessons were learned, but too late for the men who died proving them. For Patton, the long shadow was personal. His role in saving the situation was undeniable, but it did not free him. It made him more dangerous to those above him. His success reinforced everything his superiors feared about him. He had been right again, loudly, inconveniently right. And that made him a problem in a war that was increasingly about managing victory rather than seizing it. The Ardennes also reshaped American military thinking for generations. It became a case study not just in surprise attack, but in institutional complacency. Staff colleges would teach the battle as an example of what happens when intelligence is filtered through expectation. When warnings that contradict the narrative are labeled pessimism. When readiness is sacrificed for comfort. For Germany, the shadow was terminal. The Ardennes consumed the last strategic reserve of the Wehrmacht in the West. After January 1945, Germany no longer had the ability to influence the course of the war, only to prolong its suffering. The offensive that was meant to restore initiative instead ensured that when the final collapse came, it would be absolute. Yet the most enduring consequence was moral rather than military. The Ardennes stripped away the illusion that wars end cleanly once victory seems inevitable. It demonstrated that complacency kills as effectively as enemy fire, that decisions made to preserve harmony or appearances can exact their price on men who have no voice in those decisions. As Allied armies advanced toward the Rhine in early 1945, they did so with overwhelming force and renewed caution. The enemy was beaten, but no longer underestimated. The Ardennes had burned that lesson into institutional memory with a cruelty that made forgetting impossible. The war would end within months. Celebrations would follow. Medals would be awarded. But the long shadow remained, cast by frozen fields and the knowledge that the cost of ignoring inconvenient truths is always paid later, usually in blood, and usually by those least able to afford it, as the world moved on to a new order shaped not just by victory, but by the moments when victory was nearly lost and the consequences of that near disaster were written into the future, whether anyone chose to acknowledge them or not. History did not judge the Ardennes kindly, and it did not judge it quickly. For years after the war, the battle was framed as a heroic recovery, a test of Allied resolve that proved the system worked. That version was comforting, and it was incomplete. The deeper truth was harder to accept. The disaster had not been inevitable. It had been enabled. The men who paid the price never doubted that. They knew how close the front had come to unraveling. They knew how thin the line had been held, how warnings had been waved away, how confidence had replaced vigilance. They knew that courage at the bottom had compensated for failure at the top, and that compensation had come at a terrible cost. Time slowly stripped away the official language. German records confirmed what Patton's intelligence officers had seen in advance. The divisions that vanished were real. The fuel shortages were desperate. The gamble depended entirely on Allied complacency. When that complacency cracked, the offensive collapsed. The Germans themselves admitted that the one thing that truly terrified them was not Allied numbers, but Allied speed, the sudden realization that the Southern counterstroke was not improvised, but prepared. Patton was vindicated, though not rewarded. He had been right about the Ardennes. He had been right about the danger of assuming the enemy was finished. He had been right that speed could reverse disaster. And like so many times before, being right made him inconvenient. His superiors praised the army, not the man. They celebrated the recovery, not the foresight that made it possible. In the years that followed, Patton would be remembered as brilliant, reckless, controversial. Rarely was he remembered as prophetic. Yet the Ardennes stands as his quiet argument carved into frozen ground. Preparation beats optimism. Action beats debate. And wars are not won by those who wait for certainty, but by those who prepare for catastrophe while others reassure themselves it cannot happen. The lesson reaches far beyond one winter battle. It speaks to every command system that values harmony over honesty, consensus over clarity. It warns that intelligence ignored does not disappear. It waits. It waits until it arrives wearing enemy uniforms and demands payment in lives. The men who froze in foxholes and burned in tanks never needed history to validate what they experienced. They knew the truth immediately. The rest of the world took longer. It always does. Memory prefers comfort. Reality prefers accuracy. The Ardennes forced the Allied command to confront a truth it would rather not have faced. Victory does not excuse complacency. Power does not eliminate vulnerability. And dangerous men, the ones who see storms before clouds appear, are often restrained not because they are wrong, but because they are disruptive to systems that mistake stability for safety. Patton did not win the war alone. No one did. But in December 1944, he prevented it from slipping into something far darker, and he did it not by improvising heroics, but by trusting intelligence, planning ahead, and acting when others hesitated. That is not recklessness. That is command. The final judgment of the Ardennes is not about glory or redemption. It is about cost, about how many lives hesitation consumed, about how much ground was lost because warnings were inconvenient. about how close victory came to being reshaped by comfort and disbelief. If there is a lesson worth carrying forward, it is this. Wars do not punish arrogance immediately. They wait until the bill is unbearable. The Ardennes was that bill coming due. If this story changed how you see the Battle of the Bulge, if it challenged the version you were taught, leave a comment. Say which decision still angers you the most. And if you want more unfiltered history, stories where victory is stripped of its mythology and judged by the men who paid for it, stay here. History does not need applause. It needs honesty.